Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to The Disturbing Truth. We're going to continue today talking about this topic of Christianity and how the Christians view Jesus. And so in the Old Testament, there is this story that is an important story, and it's a famous story, and it's the binding of Isaac. So we're going to go into it into depth and see what's being said there and what the Christian view is on this story, because they believe that it's a foreshadowing for the crucifixion of Christ, right?
So Christians, they actually have this understanding, like that this it's like this belief, and it's actually inspired from people like thinkers like Saint Augustine. And Augustine, he had this belief, he had this theory where it's like, hey, do you know the New Testament? It's like within the Old Testament. Like the Old Testament is a foreshadowing of the New Testament.
Mm.
So many Christians right now in this day and age, this is actually a belief within them that many things that happen in the New Testament, such the stories of regarding Christ, are the Old Testament backs them up. How? So the truth of Jesus Christ and his mission is actually in the Old Testament and is a proof upon the Jews. This is based on Christians, and the New Testament, of course, the Old Testament basically validates the stories of the New Testament and Jesus' stance and claim. So, of course, this has led to Christians to draw many parallels from the Old Testament, and we're going to go into many of them as we continue on with the episode. But there's one a story that's not a story that we're going to speak of right now, but it's a side story, and that one of those parallels is of in the time of Moses, when Moses made like a statue of a snake on a cross. Okay, you can already see where it's going, and many Christians believe they believe this. So he made a cross with a statue of a cross with a snake, and it was in the middle of the desert. And he instructed the Israelites to look at it if they wanted to be healed. Okay, so now who does that also apply with? So in the New Testament, it's also to do with, the Christians say that it's a foreshadowing of Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
And just that looking at that snake healed the Israelites. Looking at Jesus on the cross would heal you.
Yeah. It's really interesting that this is actually an idea that they look at. Learning from the Old Testament it's important, right? Because you're learning from the Old Testament and you're using that book in order to understand the new stories in the new book. And this is quite important. It's a method of looking into, does that really match? Is this really how God plays things out, right?
Yeah, so Christians, they call this method typology.
Yeah.
And typology basically involves identifying words or symbols in the Old Testament that are later seen as being fulfilled in the New Testament. So scholars use this method to back up the truthfulness of the New Testament. So now that we're talking about the topic of the binding of Isaac, and which is an Old Testament story that holds so many symbolic connections to the New Testament, and we're going to go further into it.
Yes.
So the binding of Isaac, how do you explain it?
Yes. So let's look into the binding of Isaac, since that's the topic of today. If we just look at the story and we go into the story, we know that in there, God tells Abraham, peace be upon him, to take his one and only son, Isaac. So the Christians, they believe that it's said that Isaac is the one who is supposed to be taken, right? And God says it's basically this one and only son that you love. So take him to the land of Moriah, right? And he says, I want you to take him there and sacrifice him. And it was intended for Isaac to become this burnt offering, right? And so what does Abraham do? Because he's faithful, he decides that he's going to follow that dream and do it. Because this was a revelation from God, right, that he got. So he carries his wood, he carries his knife, and he goes forward. He starts. And then he ascends at the mountain in Moriah, right? And he's there ready to sacrifice, to slaughter his son Isaac.
Yeah.
And Isaac is there, he's submitting to it, he's allowing it to happen. And in the last moment, God stops it. A switch happens. So the son is spared, right?
Yeah.
Isaac is spared. And the Christians here, they're saying, wow, look at this whole story. It's a really interesting story because there is this language that is being used in this story and in the story of Jesus. The same language that is being used, just like you said, in the Old Testament is being used and also in the New Testament.
Yeah, so the language this is where the typology scholars have come forward using this method. So they found language in the Old Testament that is actually in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So for them, they're like from them own selves, they started drawing these parallels and creating these theories and connections, saying, wow, this symbolizes this.
Yeah. And we have a lot of those stories really in the Bible where there's these between the Old Testament and New Testament where these parallels are being shown, right?
So like you already said, so in Genesis 22, you mentioned the beginning of the story of Isaac where he's like, your only son, right? He says to him, your only son. And we all know that Isaac was not the only son of Abraham. Ishmael was also the son.
Yes.
So what that means is that your only son that you love, meaning the special son, the son that was special to your heart, was dear to you. So in the New Testament, they also have this parallel where God's one and only son. So God also refers to Jesus as his only son. Yeah. Just as Abraham refers to Isaac, as his only son. So that parallel is that Abraham has this special connection with Isaac, just as God has a special connection with his son Jesus, according to the Christians.
Exactly. And here, this is like one simple parallel that we can see. But in this story, there are actually so many parallels that can be mentioned. And Abu Salih, from him his peace, spoke about this topic on The Mahdi Has Appeared, the YouTube channel, where he has his conversation with Tiffany.
Yes.
And they go into other parallels from this specific story, the binding of Isaac, to see, okay, is there something else we can find similarities between?
Exactly. So basically, another one is that the father. So you see in the Old Testament, this father figure is also in the story. The father of Israel, who is Abraham, he's like he's the first patriarch of Judaism, and the children of Israel. So he's like a huge figure. He's like the father of a nation. Yeah. And he holds this very huge rank in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, you have God, who signifies that father. So now you have already two parallels that the Christians have drawn, which is like the father and the son. So the son, Jesus, father being God. And then you have the Old Testament, the son is Isaac, and the father is Abraham. Yeah.
And we see these are the parallels that the Christians are making, right? So this is what they see.
So now that you have the third parallel, which is like the first use of the word love, which the word love, the first time it's used in the Old Testament is with the story of binding Isaac, and that is when God talks to Abraham and tells him and refers to the bond between Abraham and Isaac, that this is your only son who you love so much. So in the New Testament, the love first appears when God expresses his love for Jesus during his baptism. See, now that's why for the Christians, in their mind, they're like, oh wow, it's so obvious.
Both are the first,
yes,
mentioned in the beginning of
obviously,
the Testament,
and of course,
Old and New Testament.
yeah, exactly. And love is a strong word.
Yeah.
So, and both of them are used in this specific stories.
Yeah.
So then you have the fourth one, which is the submissive obedience of the son. So Isaac willingly submits to be sacrificed by Abraham, right? Showing his obedience.
Yes.
Then you have Jesus also willingly submits to death on the cross in obedience. According to the Christians, they have Jesus who's willingly obedient towards death on the cross. He just takes it. Oh, and then the fifth parallel, which is a interesting one that you had mentioned in when you were telling us the story, and that is that we all know in the New Testament that Jesus, he carried the cross on his back. And if you look into the story of Isaac, you'll see that Isaac himself is holding the instrument or the tool that will be used in his slaughtering, and that is that wooden block. You know, he carries it himself. So now they draw this parallel too.
Yeah.
Meaning that they both accepted their fate, you know?
Yeah.
So then you have this parallel 6, which is the bound to the sacrifice, meaning Isaac is bound. This is the binding. So Isaac is bound or tied, you could say, onto the wood as he prepares for the sacrifice. And this also happens for Jesus, of course, on the cross.
He's tied on the cross, right?
Yes. He's like, you know, of course he's bound onto the cross. Then you have the parallel 7, which is the lamb and the ram. And that is, though Isaac is not directly, like, basically, they know he's not directly called the lamb of God, but his being swapped by the ram, and that spared his life, shows that, okay, now there's a symbol here, like this ram, this lamb, it's like, it's right there. And we all know that Jesus is called the Lamb of God. Yeah.
So for them, it's some type of similarity there.
Yes. And parallel 8 is that the purpose of the burnt offering. So for we know that Isaac was going to be a burnt offering to symbolize Abraham's worship and his atonement. But then, of course, Christians, they believe that Jesus dying on the cross is also for for their sins and an atonement. So these are the parallels they draw, and they come to the conclusion that the binding of Isaac is a foreshadowing of Jesus being crucified on the cross. This is their justifying Jesus' death on the cross for their sins. This is how they draw it. It's it's actually very scary how someone could actually come to that conclusion from their own selves without any authority upon them or actually any divine knowledge that had taught them that.
Yeah, because in the beginning you mentioned that this was a thinker who was having this idea, right?
Yes.
So in the end, it's not something that was really taught by the disciples the vicegerent of Jesus.
Or Jesus himself.
Or Jesus himself, like to prophesize it or something like that.
No, and that's the scary thing. So it's like very bold for them to take this and make the basis of a foundation of a whole religion that's so popular right now.
Yeah. Yet what they're doing is they're looking at this aspect of, like, their logic is, the Christians' logic right now is they're using this idea that the sunnah, which is the method of God, will always be the same. And that it always repeats, and that's not wrong in itself, to always see that okay, this story happened before, and true. Now the story is happening now. But what's important is that you look into the details and how are you interpreting those different parallels that you're finding.
Exactly.
Right. So and
you can't take the parallels to just to back up what your theory is.
Yeah.
And that's what people are
just trying to justify your theory in that sense.
Just to validate your theory that you have my theory is correct because this and this.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the logical way to go.
No, and that we will also see as we go that there are some things that you start to question and wonder and look at it and you're thinking, like, is this really a parallel? If this story of the binding of Isaac, is it this part that happened there, does it really show the same thing in the story of Jesus, or is it something different?
Exactly.
And Abu Sadiq from his piece, he shows that, and it's really interesting. As we're going to notice. Before we're going to continue, I want to remind the viewers that we do have an open line, and you can call it anytime you would like to ask questions. The phone number is there on the screen. You can call via WhatsApp or Telegram. Yes, so back to the topic. We see that what God, to the Christians, is that what God does in the Old Testament, he also does in the New Testament. The same thing's happening, and that's why they're finding these parallels. So, God did with Abraham and Isaac the same thing that he does to himself and Jesus. Okay? Why is the question.
So, that's a good question.
Because they're saying the method of God is the same, right? It always keeps repeating and never changes. But the stories differ. And this is what I said that was really important and interesting that Abu Salih from his piece brought
Yeah,
forth.
only he
There's
could bring such
something,
a
yes.
difference forward.
There's something that differs and it's clear and it's there in front of our eyes. It's really clear to see it in reality. And when Abu Sadaq explains it, you're like, how did I not see this, right? And there's a story that differs in the binding of Isaac and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And that story is that Isaac, he is actually replaced in the last moment. But Jesus, he's not replaced. He's believed that he was killed, that he stayed there, he got killed, and then he got resurrected. There is a verse in Hebrews that they use, right? And it says that Abraham, by his faith, he believed that God could resurrect his son. Because he had so much faith, he knew that if I'm going to kill my son, he's going to get resurrected. Okay? And so he was ready to slaughter his son in full faith. There was no fear. He knew his son was going to come back. So the same thing happened with Jesus. This is an idea that the Christians are using from Hebrews, right? So in Isaiah 53, we see that it's one of the Old Testament passages that is mostly used and cited as being
the Jews for the truthfulness of Jesus.
Yes, and it's being this verse is being fulfilled by Christ, right?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. And it's about this character called the suffering servant, and it talks about how he's supposed to suffer and give his life.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's this important aspect in this passage that says that God will prolong his days and he will see his offspring. And that's an interesting part because Christians believe that Jesus, his life was not prolonged. He died.
On the cross.
Yes, it was prolonged for 3 days. He got resurrected, after 3 days, sorry.
Then he was lifted to heaven.
But then he was lifted to heaven. So here we see that he prolonged his days. Okay, let's say, for sure, 3 days, after 3 days you got resurrected, your days were prolonged, if you believe that, even though it doesn't mean that, right? But it claims he will see his offspring.
Yeah.
And Christians do not believe that Jesus have an offspring.
Yeah.
So here it becomes a bit confusing because it goes against the belief of Christianity. And Abu Salih from his piece here, he mentions like a side topic. He said that Isaiah is such an important chapter. It has so many hidden secrets in there. And because it talks about the suffering servant, and for the Jews, they see that they believe that it's Israel as a nation. So it's Israel that suffered, right? And Israel that goes through.
Yeah, for them it's like Israel with its captivity, its bondage, what he went through with Pharaoh and everything. It's about Israel.
It's about Israel.
And what it's going to go through in the future.
Yeah. So that's how the Jews explain it, and they're like, no, this is not about Jesus.
Yeah.
And obviously the Christians, they believe this is about Jesus.
Yeah.
And the Muslims, which is interesting, they believe that it's someone else.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is a topic that would be so amazing to go into. And Abu Sadaq, he says, like, let's just a side note, we'll talk about it another time. And so let's just go back to the story again, because this, as we said, this passage is important. And we find here that it's talking about, to the Christians, Jesus, whose days are going to be prolonged, really. But let's go back to the story of the binding of Isaac.
Yeah. Okay. So you made me very interested in the rest of the story.
I would have loved. We would have loved to go into it, but as Abu Salih from his piece didn't really proceed in there.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I was just thinking out loud. Like I would love to actually hear it. So of course, with the binding of Isaac, now we go back to the part where it's like, okay, so there is this like difference that he brought forward, like he drew to our attention, and that is like Isaac, like he was willing to be sacrificed, but we know that with Jesus it was other than that. So you see that, okay, so God commands Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, right? So he willingly, with full, complete faith, says, yes, Father. And in obedience, he goes forth and he doesn't resist it. But this is a huge contrast with Jesus Christ's reaction in the New Testament. And it's a very famous scene that takes place, where he's on his knees quietly. He withdraws himself. He's on his knees in prayer towards God, and he asks God to take away this cup from him. So we see from the scene, and just as how Christians have portrayed it, is that he was a bit reluctant. He was at fear. There was some fear, and that was a huge contrast with him and Isaac's calmness towards the sacrifice. So we have now this complete obedience with Isaac, who has no fear. But then we have this, this fear aspect, or this hesitation, if you want to call it, like even if it's a slight hesitation from Jesus. And if you base it on just that obedience, then you are directly kind of just saying, because obedience is what makes a servant close to God, is that Isaac in this specific scene and test was better than Jesus. If ultimately
you could say that, right?
You could say that if you
go
look
by
at
the story in this way that they are looking at it.
Exactly. So there's this difference now, right? So if you draw these stories as parallels and you put them side by side, the willingness and obedience of Isaac, without a shadow of a doubt, is much better. There is no hesitation. There is no hesitation written for Isaac, but there is for Jesus Christ. So if you put it based on that, then Isaac's obedience is way better.
Yeah, and that's a point I think that is really important to emphasize on, because the Christians have not commented on this, and they've left it out, and like
no, they don't talk about it.
They don't talk about it, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we see here that the second that was the first main difference that we noticed in this story. There's a second main difference that was Sadiq from his piece he emphasized on, and I want to quote him, because he says in a beautiful way. He says, God at the final moment, he reveals to Abraham that I don't sacrifice my messengers. I don't send somebody to be a proof, meaning I don't send a human being and then I sacrifice them.
Yeah.
Like God wouldn't send someone and be like, okay, now you're going to be a sacrifice and I'm going to allow you to die in this terrible way, right?
Yeah.
And Abu Salih from his piece, he continues, he says, I don't do that. Meaning God says, I don't do that. In fact, that's what distinguishes him from the gods of the Canaanites. Because the gods of the Canaanites, they're always accepting these baby offerings where they take their babies and kill them and sacrificing and offer them to the Lord. Not the God of the Old Testament. He doesn't do that, right? The God of the Old Testament and the New Testament, he doesn't do that to Abraham.
And what's fascinating about this part, what Abu Sayyid is drawing people's attention to, is that, look, you have to understand, like, if people who know scripture, who know the Talmud, who know the detailed story, or who have read the book of Yeshur, they would know that in Abraham's time, right, the sacrificing of children was at its height.
Yeah.
Like, they had this Moloch, they would sacrifice and offer their children to the gods and the idols in the time of Abraham. That's why he had to axe them.
Yeah.
And in those times, they would have these massive statues, massive, like, statues of Moloch, and then it'd be like, they'd have these like open ovens, and they would place their children, and this is what Abraham would see. This is his time period.
That's what he was against.
Yes, he was against it, and he would see, see that they sacrifice their children like this for their gods, for a fake god. Look how much faith they had in their fake gods. So it would also, if you continue, it makes sense why this concept of sacrifice had come in that time period. But then God showed otherwise. Yeah, he showed him, I'm not like those gods.
Yes,
you see.
Yeah,
you think you may expect, like, the people might expect that I may be like those gods. Hence why the dream came to Abraham. Yeah. There's a reason the dream came, and I was like, we revealed that. But yet it didn't happen. So God proved to him, no, it's not. This is not how I work. Yeah, Yeah. So he took away the child just because he's not like the other gods, and he replaced him with of course, with an animal.
Yeah, and then in the end, God said, "What? This was just a test. I wasn't gonna allow it to happen."
Exactly.
So, God also declares that He's proud of Abraham for having the willingness to do it.
It's the willingness.
It's the willingness, right? Because you sacrifice, and it's the one you love, the only one that you love, right? It's someone who's so dear to your heart, you wouldn't want to see him dead, right? No. And yet you decided that you would love God above your child, and you would do anything for God, and you know in your heart that God will bring him back, right? Because he believed he's going to be resurrected, right? So for you, it's not even anything, like it wasn't even a test for Abraham. He was proud of him.
Yeah.
So he replaced the Isaac with a substitute, right?
Yeah.
Which is the ram, and he comes. And Abba Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he says that this ram is what? He says that it's a creation of God. Okay? Why does he mention it? Why is he saying it's a creation of God? Because he said this creation was specifically created to be the substitute of Isaac and to take his place.
See,
so it wasn't just any ram.
No, it was created for that scene.
Yeah.
Event.
Yes. So this ram was his whole purpose in life was to actually be the substitute. Okay. And so what does Abraham do? He unbinds Isaac, right? And he goes and takes the ram and he binds the ram, binds him up, and he slaughters the ram.
Yeah.
And he takes the blood and he sprinkles it on the altar.
Yeah.
And he says to God, oh, please accept the blood of this ram in the place of Isaac.
Yes.
And here we see, this is where it's not a foreshadowing of the story of Jesus. It's impossible. Because God in the New Testament is doing something different than what God in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not the same. And he sacrificed. He doesn't sacrifice his son.
Yeah, no, he doesn't.
In the Old Testament.
Yeah.
How can you say that he sacrificed his son in the New Testament and then they're parallels? It's not a parallel because it's supposed to be. It would be different if Jesus was not the son of God, right? Because to them they say he's the son of the Father. So the son of the father Abraham, Isaac, who's the son of Abraham, he wasn't sacrificed. Why would then the son of God be sacrificed? There's no parallel here.
You know, I have actually heard some Christians say because God is greater and he could do it. But the thing is, this is the fascinating part. There's also proof against that statement.
Yeah.
Some Christians, they're like, yeah, but obviously, because God is greater and Jesus is much more dearer than what Abraham could ever be, what Isaac could ever be to Abraham. And Jesus and God's connection is much stronger and much more divine and much holier than any other connection, bond between a father and a son. So they're like, yeah, God went forth with the sacrifice. Abraham didn't. But the thing is, Abraham was willing. That's the key, you see. So you can't accuse Abraham of not being strong enough because Abraham was in full obedience. And God admits in the New Testament that I was looking at your willingness.
Yes.
And he was proud of his willingness.
Yes.
And he gave Abraham such a high station and made him fruitful and gave him a nation and made him a patriarch. And like till this day, people know Abraham.
Yeah.
So it's like basically it's baseless.
Yeah.
This argument is baseless. That God is greater, but that's not the point.
Yeah.
We're not saying who's greater. Of course God is greater.
Yeah. And also the second thing is that the son there is hesitant, but the other son wasn't hesitant.
So either way you can't it's like you're trying to it's too far fetched. Like they're trying to you can't stretch it that long, you know. It's a big stretch and there's no need for it. You just have to admit the evidence and like logically like what's presented before us we have to with open mind examine it and see then okay, is there any other meaning for this story that is taking place in the Old Testament? Because we're not saying leave the stories, no, of course not. No. But you have to investigate them further. Yeah. So Abu Sadiq from his piece, he now concluded that okay, we don't. There's too much of it. The difference is a bit is there's a lot of difference, and some of it it doesn't help the narrative actually at all with the New Testament, and in fact can make Jesus, peace be upon him, in a strange light. Yeah. That's not actually. That doesn't justify his true rank. Yeah. You know, and Jesus is like the best of them. Yeah. And with typology, you can't pick and choose. You can't say this part, typology follows, but in this part, well, God is greater, Jesus is greater, so it doesn't follow. You know? Exactly. You said it right. So the point is that this method, like if you use it, you actually drag down Jesus's position and like, invalidate kind of his claim.
Yeah.
Like he didn't come to do that.
Yeah.
So then if the binding of Isaac isn't a foreshadowing of the New Testament, is it foreshadowing anything? That's the question. And what's fascinating is that then I was like, he then moves on. Okay, now we looked into the New Testament, and in his episode of the trilogy of the Torah, the Bible, the Gospels, and the Quran, he mentioned that these three books have to be read together for you to understand the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So it's like people are always looking at the tree amongst the forest, right? They're not looking at the forest to see like what really is going on. So we find out that if you read the Old Testament and then you read the New Testament, but then you move on to the story of Christ in the Quran, it's actually fascinating. You'll actually find there is actually a parallel there too, you know, and that perhaps, and it seems that the Old Testament story of the binding of Isaac is foreshadowing a Jesus to a degree, but in the Quran, the Quranic narrative way more than the New Testament. So them two are more like seem to be like synchronized than the story, the narrative that the Christians play. I'm not saying the Gospels themselves, but I'm talking about the interpretation of the scholars of Christianity.
Yeah.
So we see that the binding of Isaac in the Old Testament, right, is clearly a foreshadowing for the Islamic interpretation of Jesus's crucifixion. So you see, okay, what makes the Islamic one different to the New Testament? Okay, in the New Testament, Jesus dies on the cross.
Yep.
But in the Quran, it is mentioned in the verses that it is appeared that he died on the cross and God raised him, meaning he was replaced.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was replaced by another. So the Quran verse says something that is actually similar to the story in the Old Testament.
Yes.
And I think that's very fascinating.
That is really fascinating because it's clear. I mean, Isaac was replaced with a ram. Here, okay, makes sense. Jesus was replaced with something else.
Yes, and it's by a special character, a special being, an angel, you can call it. So there's a replacement in both stories. Okay, so it was appeared that maybe Isaac might be slaughtered, and it was appeared that Jesus may be slaughtered, but then they were replaced by another entity.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does this mean? It means that this act, right? Muslims acknowledge Jesus's importance.
Yeah.
He's not just somebody, just as God has said in the Old Testament that he would never sacrifice. Like Judaism believes is that God would never sacrifice Isaac, who is such a big creation, like someone so beloved to Abraham, when he could easily put in his place an animal.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any sense. There's no need for that.
And that animal was its whole sole purpose to be was to be slaughtered, right? To be in the place, be a substitute. That was his whole purpose.
Yes, exactly. So the whole purpose of the binding of Isaac is actually God's mercy.
Yeah.
How merciful God is that he would never allow his beloved ones or the beloved one of his prophets and his prophet, because Isaac was, to go through such a death, like to die in such a way, to be slaughtered by the hands of his own father. So he's like he makes eye to eye contact with the man that brought him to the earth, and then he gets taken away by that man that had brought him to the earth. It's the worst way to go, actually, for if you think about it, for a child, like the one that you're given to be entrusted by. You're saying that the merciful God is going to allow that to happen? For sure not. But that's what makes Isaac so great, that he was even willing to do that by the hands of his own father for the sake of God. Yeah.
And the other thing that there's a parallel between Islam or the Quran, what the Quran said, the story in the Quran and the Old Testament, is that the ram was there for the whole purpose of the ram was to be the substitute, right? Well, it was the same thing with this angel that replaced, that took the place of Jesus. His whole purpose was to take the place of Jesus and be the one sacrificed instead. This is what the Muslims believe in. This is what the Quran states, right?
Yes, exactly. So they believe that there's a creation created for the intended purpose of being that replacement of that sacrificial.
Yeah. And so here we see that it is now, we found there's parallels that are more likely to be parallels between the Quran and the Old Testament rather than the Quran and the New Testament. We mentioned two things now.
So basically, Isaac's near death actually, supports actually the Islamic narrative of, well, of course, the Quran, let's say, of Jesus's crucifixion, and actually gives weight to the Quran.
Yeah.
So the Old Testament actually backs the Quran way more than what the interpretation of the scholars is for the New Testament. So then, if the Old Testament, if you study it deeply, it can actually really, really, truly affirm many things that are in the Quran.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating.
That is fascinating because you mentioned before that you have to look at the holy books as a continuation of each other. So first it's the New Testament, the Old Testament, then the New Testament, and the Quran. And what did Abu Salih from his peace say before? He said that when the Quran came, when the New Testament came, it corrected parts of the Old Testament. And so when the Quran came, it corrected parts of the New Testament. And this is exactly what's happening. The story here is being corrected. God is correcting it. He's saying, actually, this is what happened with Jesus. This is the real story. And there was something wrong mentioned in the New Testament. It was a misconception. People didn't understand it and they wrote it that way. But now the Quran came, Prophet Muhammad came, and he corrected that. Yes, he corrected it. And now we see that the parallels are more matching between the Quran and the story of Jesus and the binding of Isaac.
Yeah, like the whole point is that you have to read the three books together for you to have a bit more of a better understanding of what really took place. And it's true, because why is another book coming place if the first book is perfected? They wouldn't be known if the first book was perfected and not tainted by the people. Or its interpretations when tainted or they're changed throughout time, because it can happen, then God would never send another prophet down with another book.
Yeah.
So the concept of the Gospels coming down, they did come down. The Psalms coming down, they did come down with prophets. Like David, for example, it did come down with David. But the idea that another book coming down is not foreign and shouldn't really scare the Christians, and nor should it scare the Muslims or the Jews. It shouldn't scare anybody. Why would you limit God to one book?
Yeah,
is a good question, actually.
Yeah,
like,
true.
why would you limit the unlimited being that you worship, that is, has authority above the whole universe, to one book? And stories that perhaps have so much details and are so rich, and there are so many lessons to them, and that you would only limit knowing those stories through one lens. When there's so many lenses you can go through.
Yeah.
So I find fascinating how I was like talks to his Christian viewers, telling them that they can just. There's nothing wrong with like critical thinking, and there's nothing wrong with having an open mind and looking at other perspectives of these same stories. At the end of the day, all three stories are in all the books. So it would be very fascinating to actually, just as a logical thinker, to read into them without being biased or without having some judgment against a specific party, or how you want to stay away from something because you believe this specific party is upon falsehood. But what can it hurt you to look into it?
Yeah, because in the end, these books are not just there for reading as stories or like something that you read during a holy day to get blessings, right? It's to actually learn from them and understand, right? And see, here is similarities, right? And here this makes more sense. And Abu Salih from his piece, he ends this episode as he's talking, and he says something that I will quote here. He says, "I think if there's somebody who's fair and takes the story of the binding of Isaac, and he says, okay, let's take this as a parallel. Let's take this as a foreshadowing of one of these two stories. Then we'll leave the audience to decide. Is this story foreshadowing more the Christian version, or is it foreshadowing more and paralleling more with the Muslim version? That's the question." So he makes people think. Here he has revealed, or he has shown, he has put forth on the table, like here's what the New Testament says, here's what the Quran says. Which one matches more
with the Old Testament?
With the Old Testament.
And you know
right?
what's fascinating as well is that, like, you have to understand something. So let's say if the Christian and the Muslim is in debate with one another, right? And over the narratives of the stories of Jesus Christ, it would actually make sense for them both to refer back to the people of the book, and the book would be the Torah, the Old Testament. So naturally, I'm just thinking out loud as if I were a Christian. So naturally, if now the Quran has this story and we have this story as a Christian, I'm saying, then it would make sense to refer back to the book that came down before our books.
Yeah, because they believe in typology, right? They believe in looking back in the old book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Muslims also need to be aware that their own book actually tells them to refer back to the people, of the books. And those people are the Jews and the Christians. So it would be the Torah and the Gospels. So if you do refer back and you like study them, like truly study them, and the best to study them is to actually also study them with the Imam of your time, for sure.
This is what I was thinking throughout this whole time as we're speaking. If we look at it in reality, who is it? We started off by saying that this was a thinker that came with this idea, trying to explain all this. When we go to people who are not sent by God to come and explain to you something that is a divine book, that is a holy book, a story that exists in these holy books, and you hear a thought from someone not sent by God, it's really dangerous, because we know from the hadith from Ahlul Bayt that the Quran will never separate from the Ahlul Bayt, right? They will always be together. Yeah. They will always, like, you cannot explain the Quran, you cannot explain the Torah, you cannot explain the Bible without having the hujjah of the time.
And yeah, exactly. Like, for example, the words of Christ could never be, you can't just put them up for interpretation or have somebody who's not obviously guided by God or divinely appointed by God to guide you regarding translate those books.
Yeah.
That's why Simon Peter was such a key. There's a reason why he was given the keys to the heaven. That's why there's a reason why Jesus called him the rock. And same with the Imams. Hence why there's a reason why the Quran cannot be separated from the Ahlul Bayt, meaning the Ahlul Bayt who were divinely appointed. Not just, it's because it's his family, and the family knows better because they're living in the same house, and they know what he's saying, because some Shias go by that narrative.
But that's why they believe also that the companions are so great, because he would live next to them.
Actually,
at that time,
the Shia Sunni debate is this, that the family was very close, they lived in the same house, they knew what he was saying, they knew him better, Imam Ali knew him better. No, it was because Imam Ali was chosen. It was chosen by God. Yeah. And it's not because Simon Peter was so close to Jesus. In fact, Judas Iscariot was the best of the disciples at one point. There was a point before he was betrayed that he was the best of them. Yeah. But Simon Peter was the one who was chosen
by God.
So God knows best.
Yes.
So you have to listen to the vicegerent of the time for you to understand the words of the predecessor.
Yeah. And it's so important, because now that we have someone who is divinely appointed, and we have Abu Salih from his peace with us, who has claimed the will, who has come with divine knowledge, who has risen the banner of supremacies to God, right? And he has shown us the reality here in this episode that we spoke about, and it's just like one story. It's like drinking cold water. It's like so soothing to the heart, and you feel like
you finally things make sense.
It makes sense. There's no like and you start thinking.
And also, you're not upon a faith that's shaky, and you're not and unsure, and you're uncertain of what are you really believing in? Who made you even believe in this? What are you basing it on? What is it based on? Is it my parents? Is it based on a priest or a scholar or a rabbi or imam of a masjid only? And that's uncertainty, and that's very scary for your salvation and very scary for your hereafter, and you shouldn't base your hereafter on such shaky grounds. It's like, as the Quran says, that they base their whole, like, basically imagine basing your whole religion on the web of a spider.
No, it's not going to hold. It's going to crumble and fall down, right?
Yes.
So having this foundation and belief in Abu Sadiq from his peace, and knowing that he's the truth, as long as you know he is from God and you believed in his proof that he brought forth, then you know that everything he says is the truth, right? So
And it just makes sense. It's not just that he says things; he actually says things and
proves
backs it with
yeah.
evidence
Yeah.
as a proof upon mankind.
And that's what he has done here. Like, this is not just him saying that this is what the reality is without proving it and end up. No, he's actually
he's making you think.
He make you think. So today we went through this episode, and Abu Salah, from his piece, what did he do? He made the viewers think, and we hope that we've made our Christian viewers think, and our other viewers who are interested in this topic to understand it better and get their minds moving a little bit. And inshallah, in the next episode, we'll bring something else forward, another disturbing truth, something else that Abu Salah from his piece has revealed through his channel, through the YouTube channel that Mahdi has appeared. And I think we'll stop there. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.